The Norman Foster Foundation public debates are now starting.
Ready? Okay. Very good. So are we starting with a photo?
Yes.
We are. Very good.
All the rooms are with screens already and everybody's...
Okay, so very good. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start with a photograph of all of the participants this evening. So if I could invite the participants on stage. We have a photograph. And then, yep, please, onto stage. Well, it is from the photograph, so just...
By the way, next
Okay.
time. So, all here?
Yeah. Very good. Perfect. Thank you. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night in Madrid. This wouldn't be anything without the audience, so thank you very much for joining us. We've been this week at the Norman Foster Foundation talking about cities and affordable housing with 10 invited scholars and invited speakers, and we're going to give you some flavour of what we've been discussing during the course of the week and then have a debate together. I want to start a little bit by trying to unpack some of the issues around affordable housing in our cities. The challenge is that we've had rapid urbanisation. 55% of people now live in cities. That's 4.2 billion people. And that's happened very quickly. So in Brazil, 90% urbanisation from the 50s. We now have from 2.5 million people to 22.5 million people. So that's a massive increase, and it's all unplanned. And because of the nature of that unplanned urbanisation, we've now got 1.1 billion people living in informal settlements and inadequate housing. But it's not just a developing world problem, it's also a developed world problem. So in the city where I live, in Berlin, there's regular tension between public and private sectors. 2 years ago, some of the last squatted settlements in Berlin were evacuated, and there's a lot of political unrest around that. And these topics are appearing through many of our cities now across Europe, forcing out key workers with increasing rents and property prices going up. So many people now affected by the topic of affordable housing. That's a massive problem today, but it's only a problem that's going to grow in the future. So the UN predicts population growth to 10 million by 2050, and 7 out of 10 people living in cities. That means we're going to add 3 billion people to our urban population. In effect, what that means is we've got to build 100,000 homes globally per day to keep up with that demand, as well as fixing the problems we already have from unplanned urbanisation. And housing is so fundamental to delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it becomes super urgent if we want to achieve this. So it affects not just housing, but it's an issue of employment, of health and education. If you don't have a home, you can't get access to those things. And there are many constraints in the way that we've created the world we have today. So one of our constraints, construction productivity, has been flat for decades compared to manufacturing, which has grown. We have a massive problem with climate change and the carbon impacts from our materials. So about 50% of the carbon that we generate comes from the built environment, comes from our buildings, and a lot of that comes from the materials that we're using as well. So 50% from materials and 50% from the way we're operating and using our buildings. And whilst we took for granted construction materials were readily available, more recently we've seen sand for construction has become a scarce resource, and that seems unthinkable. And it's not just sand, it goes through all of the resources now that we have. So what are the solutions given these constraints? We have to reuse what we've already got. This is a project from Lacaton and Vassal, now known worldwide. Reusing old concrete tower blocks, refurbishing them, adding a bay and creating better quality space for the residents. And we encounter this problem in lots of our cities. We're also trying to industrialise construction. This is a modular project in it's called Atlantic Yards in New York. And we're trying to develop these modular projects through a lot of the construction industry. Actually, it's worldwide. And then trying to use the materials and the resources that we have, the concept of the circular economy. So it's keeping materials at their highest value for as long as possible. So reusing resources. This project was the Holcim gold winner, and it uses urban mining to collect materials. It's in Switzerland, put them together and make the building, and it also uses an existing building to build upon. And then a solution, we've this week been enlightened by stories from Vienna. And I think probably most of us know Vienna's had a fantastic social housing program for 100 years, which is great. Just recently it started to grow in terms of population. But the model of how they've done that is a lesson, I think, for other cities to learn from. We'll hear more about that. And this project is from Vienna. It's called Alt-Erla. And it's a fantastic example of dense high-rise construction, but working well with public spaces. So planning and the quality of design are super important in terms of solving this problem, but also not creating the next problem. And so I'm now going to invite our speakers to come up and give you their 5-minute versions. We're very privileged to have speakers from so many different parts of the world, and so it gives us a great opportunity to compare the context and the situations that we face. So we'll start with Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. I want to share with you my 5 minutes of hope. And I will not show spectacular architecture. I saved that for tomorrow, for which you're all invited. But I want to talk about the role of community in regenerative design. Regenerative or circular design is design where there is no waste, where all materials are being used over and over again. And we get into this dynamic mode of constant flow of materials, but also of people and function and of place. So a building has become as dynamic as we people are, as life is. The only constant is change. I read that somewhere today. And of course, architecture has not been like this for a long time, and it requires lots of rules and regulations and massive change in policies. But I want to talk about 2 simple observations that our studio made in the past years. And the first observation is the project, a housing project for these 8 households of architects and theater makers. And they were the ones that got the first sight of the famous MVRDV radical urban planning plot in Amsterdam, in Almere, sorry. And they said, Peter, we want a big house because we are artists. It needs to be cheap because we have no money, and it has to be super sustainable. We said, that's contradictory. Big is not cheap, cheap is not sustainable. So we said, you're going to have a simple house, a very simple house. You will basically have a wooden box, and that's it. And you will have 7 windows, but you can choose from only 4 types, and that's it. You can place them wherever you want, but this is it. This is the project. It's a wooden slab of 100 meters serving 8 households. And it became so popular that we made 3 of these 100-meter slabs because people loved it. But what I thought was most interesting, that they really challenged us to be more sustainable. They said, Peter, you can do better. You can be more circular. You can be more regenerative. And then at the same time, we started building this high-rise for 400 social houses, and this has a facade of plastic recycled material, 100% plastic waste on the facade. But after each design phase, the commercial developer said, Peter, less circular, less ambition, it's too expensive, it's too expensive. So I thought the hope is in the people, hope is in the community. The next project that we will do will start with people, will start with community, where you don't build for yourself, but as a group of people, you take responsibility for the whole, and you are in control of the whole. So we won this competition, and I thought this is it. We will design something with a 400-year-old Dutch almshouse concept, a very old social housing concept, and start from there. And we designed a process and not a product, which is very uncomfortable for architects. We started the housing cooperation. And these are the future inhabitants, talking about circular strategies that commercial developers can only dream of. So that was really inspiring. This is it, 100 houses, of which half, so 50 apartments are social housing. And this is, of course, not unusual in Vienna, in Zurich, in Munich. They have projects like this. For Holland, it's revolution. The first time in decades that 50 social houses are being developed, built, and paid and controlled by their own inhabitants. The 100 households own the whole property. You don't own your house. So we found out that actually in communities you will find that they are radically open to new regenerative design solutions. They see sharing as a way of life, and they are open, and this is of course the key to unusual, intelligent, low-key, low-cost, really smart design solutions.
Hello. So Maria will later speak about what is a city that can be planned for caring for people. But I have been trying to start from within the house as a social care act. Let me explain in a very few words, in a very short time, what do I mean with that. The house is a fundamental architectural component that has structured our everyday life and defines the relationship with our bodies and other people. Thus, the house continuously remains a contested space manipulated by social, political, and economical forces. Contemporary domestic environments are highly commoditized, shaped around formal preconceptions. The formal preconceptions that are the result, or maybe the consequence, of the society of today. We live in a moment where this phrase that I'm going to say now applies to an extreme. To exist, we need to produce. But if we think of it carefully, to produce, we need first to exist. The house of today and the desire of the whole world, how people imagine how to live, is designed over three major frictions, as Fernanda Canales clearly says. The house is a place of rest, as if work could be separated from life and housework would disappear. The house is a private property within everybody's reach, as if when considering it that, a commodity, it will not be determined by market-driven dynamics, making it unaffordable for the majority. And the house is a sanctuary for the nuclear family, husband, wife, and children, as if no other means or social relationships would exist. Unfortunately, many of these preconceptions are not only in the dreams of the majority of the world right now, but they're turned and built into local building codes and administrative norms worldwide. And not only that they are in the real imaginary, these are not possible for the majority of the population. But mostly, not that they're not possible, they're not affordable, they're really not fitting their ways of life. And I think we architects had been the culprit because we have been repeating this model and perpetuating these impositions that are really expelling the majority. This is why I have dedicated most of my career in order to understand how to create models to allow anyone to create their own existence, eliminating preconceptions, opening paths for erasure of discrimination, and therefore making places that hold bodies to exist, but each body with its own possibility and way of inhabiting. I have worked around the notion of care, which, ignoring the economy and erased from our cities, is tucked into our households. It is the labor we rely to exist. Care is today the unpaid labor in which capital is sustained. The current dynamics and physical realm promotes individuals and actors who most pursue their own labor practices to earn and support themselves. These earnings being fictionally commensurate with their work. If the city is shaped by this today, we must imagine then, what is the city of care? That one that holds bodies. We have been really trying to create models that are, first of all, affordable, but that they don't eliminate the possibilities of people to shape their own life. This is a design strategy that can be configured depending on their social, cultural, or physical region in which they live. This is a model for Mexico and cannot be replicated anywhere, especially not on the costs, that can be built with $8,000. Peter was speaking about making it lower. Well, I live in a context where lower is lower, is lower. So we are trying to create houses that don't determine the use of spaces. So it's not that they have a kitchen and a bathroom and 2 rooms. There is space to create a kitchen or not, an inside kitchen or an exterior kitchen, an inside bathroom or a dive bathroom outside, depending on where you live, and maybe sewage is not available. We have then further developed more strategies to understand if maybe the possibility of detaching the structures and just building separate modules that can be accommodated in different ways according to your type of family, according to your type of plot, according to your type of urbanism, can be the solution. Or opening channels for different ways of accommodations in more dense environments like Mexico City, creating possibilities of structures that are able to expand and contract within the process of the life of someone. Life is a process, and architecture is a static thing that freezes in moments of time a specific situation. So how can we create architecture that becomes a platform for anyone to create their own existence and allowing life as a process? That's what we do. Thank you very much.
Great. 5 minutes, it's not very much time, so I'm just going to make 2 points. One is around speed and acceleration, and the second point is about situational awareness. So yesterday, the 8th billionth person was born on the planet, and that is up from 2 billion people in 1922. So my first question is, how do we even begin to process that level of acceleration? I'm a tennis fan, so let me use the example of the great Spaniard, Rafael Nadal. So I just want you to imagine that you were lucky enough to hit some tennis balls with Rafael Nadal, and Rafa was going to say to you, okay, I'm going to serve the ball to you. And Rafa says, I'm going to serve it exactly to this point. And I'm even going to tell you exactly how hard I'm going to serve it. And then Rafa serves the ball, and you are prepared, and you take a swing at the ball, and obviously the ball is way behind you and hits the back of the fence before you even know about it. My point is that is the situation we are in as a civilization. You know, we are standing there. We know exactly what is about to happen. We have the demographics. we have the biophysics, and we're not prepared. My second point I want to make, I live in Africa, and I want to be a little bit specific for the audience, especially we have so many young people in the room. I want to say to you that your life will be heavily conditioned by what is about to happen in Africa. The population in Africa today is 1.2 billion and will increase to 2.7 billion by 2050. And I want to tell you from my own personal experience that climate change is already here and extreme poverty is already here. This is a photograph I took 3 months ago in South Sudan in a wetland region called the Sud. And this family, mainly young girls there, between the ages of 8 and 14 years old, are pulling the only possessions they have left in the world because their village was wiped out by climate change floods. When I met them, they had been in the water for 2 days. Can you imagine? And the water is full of snakes, and they're exhausted, and they haven't eaten for 3 or 4 days. And they're heading to a United Nations displacement camp, which is another 30 kilometers in the water to get there. And the camp is not very much. It's just some shelter. Occasionally you get some food subsistence. There is a risk of cholera there. No one knows when they're going to return to their village. So when Stuart made incredible points about the urban fabric, but I want to say behind the urban fabric, particularly in Africa, we have a system where the historical carbon emissions that we have delivered on the planet is actually wiping out communities even now. And the strange thing about this question is that even though this situation is coming at us like Rafael Nadal's serve, super fast, can we prepare ourselves? Our political leaders and our media is treating it like a slow motion train wreck, and they're not able to process what is actually happening. So just want to leave you with this context. In our discussion, you can see that I'm not wholly negative. I do believe that there are solutions to offer, but I do think it's very important just to understand the gravity of the situation we're in and the scale of the challenge. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Obviously, I'm the only one who's not an architect, so I will not be talking about buildings. I would like to take you to Vienna, which is, by the way, one of the most privileged places that there are in the world. And I would like to focus on neighborhoods and on what affordable housing can do for our cities. Now, how do we design a city for all? Obviously not like this, right? This is how we used to do it. It does not react, that is very bad, yes. I would say, and this is the first thought that I would like to share with you tonight and tease you a little bit, I would say that design for all has a lot to do with designing a city for children, with thinking of children's needs and designing around it. Why? Well, by the way, and this is something that we have very much applied in Vienna, which is regularly ranked as the world's #1 in terms of livability, but not only ranked, but also experienced as one of the most livable cities in the world. So what does all this have to do with each other? Again, obviously, there is one crucial question, and that is, what is urban life quality? I say urban life quality has to do with designing a city around the needs of children. Why? What is it that we need, that we long for our children? Well, we long for our children to grow up in a healthy and safe environment. We want them to be able to move around freely, to play with water, to have access to nature, and all these things are things that we long for ourselves as well. Which is why young couples, as soon as they know that the first child is arriving, will move most of the times out of the city towards the suburbs so that their children can have a happy childhood. And once they're there, not only do we have cities that grow as endless carpets of little houses, we have this picture, this image here, which could be in the morning out of town, could be in the evening towards the suburbs. And it means that we spend the rest of our lives in the cars, trying to reach work, trying to bring the kids to school. Congestion, air pollution. We all know what this means. So, it's about creating a city that's good for children because it's good for us all. It's about providing the qualities that I've been speaking about at the heart of our cities. And the role of affordable housing is crucial to that, because what you see here in the backdrop is, by the way, all affordable housing in Vienna. So here's the threefold strategy. It's affordability, because the second reason why suburbs are growing is that young people and young families can't afford to live in the city. It's about livability, as I have just defined it, and it's about community, because creating urban quarters that are places for life, where we'll live because we want to and not because we have to, is something that you can only achieve if you work together with the people. Now, takes a while. Okay, could you please? Yes. Here's the second thought I would like to share with you. Social housing, affordable housing, subsidized housing, name it as you like, has to target middle class, especially in the context, of course, of Northern American European cities. It is all about providing high quality, ecological, cost-efficient, and participatory housing for, again, young families of the middle class. So, it is also about one very, very crucial aspect, and that is land and land prices. Land is a limited edition, as we all know, and a basic reason for the housing crisis, the affordability crisis that we're experiencing in our cities, is that land prices are rising, besides construction prices lately. So what we did in Vienna was to introduce a zoning category, which is extremely radical and says that as soon as you build more than 150 units, 2/3 of them need to be subsidized housing. It is mandatory. And that means that even if you negotiate with the city and decide to build and decide to actually finance things that are needed for the common good, like example given, you could build the school as a developer, then this can be reduced to 50% plus one unit, but it can never ever be less than 50% at least affordable housing. I will leave it at that. I will just say in the end that if we make the circle and look into what we have been talking about tonight, we will see that in the end it is all about involving communities, it is all about flexibility, it is all about designing new urban quarters and houses together with the people. And as you can see, this is the quality and what it looks like in Vienna. So if you want to know how this is financed, you will have to ask me later. Thanks.
So I did promise that the speakers would be diverse in terms of their geography, and I think that was pretty clear. Thank you all for fantastic presentations. I've had the opportunity of being mesmerised this week by these conversations. Jonathan, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure.
And this kind of like speed that things are coming at us, and we're sort of standing there in the headlights a little bit. But do you have hope that some of these ideas that we're exploring in different parts of the world could be transferable and could be delivered at speed, or is that too much to hope for?
No, I'm extremely, I know I don't sound it, but, or I didn't sound it, but I am actually very optimistic. I think, obviously in Africa you have 52% of the population is under the age of 19. Very few of them have jobs, but that produces a sort of energy and a creativity and a problem solving and a work ethic, which is quite extraordinary. And I would also highlight that most of my work these days is around artificial intelligence. And of course, AI is not going to lift extreme poverty in and of itself. That's about rights for girls, especially rights for girls. It's about water, it's about shelter. But I do think that the advances that we're making in artificial intelligence allow optimization technologies to be put in place at a really affordable cost. I'll just give you one very quick example. Would be my group took garden hose pipe and cut holes in it with a knife, and then wrote an algorithm to create drip feed irrigation of an Android phone. So all it does is release water down this hose pipe into, and it costs $4 plus the program.
So it's possible to bring innovation into solving some of these problems.
And we have to, but it's like an imagination play.
Yeah.
And we don't have enough imagination on the table.
Maria, from your perspective as well, I know one of the things that you're finding is people are coming to you to understand how successful the program of social housing has been in Vienna, and do you find that that is exportable to other parts of the world?
Yes,
and which parts of it as well?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's not directly exportable. You always have to translate it into the context, into different contexts. Let me give you one example. I think it's always about being creative around cost, the issue of cost. So one reason why Vienna has been so successful with the quality of social housing is that, example given, we said, we will free ourselves of the grid of streets. We will introduce vast, accessible green spaces in the middle, high density at the edges, and we will skip producing garages underneath buildings, which are extremely expensive. We will do collective car parking at the edges, so you need to walk clearly the last man home. And we will take what we have saved, example given, and produce swimming pools on the rooftops, which then means that you have beautiful places for life. And you have places that are good for the entire neighborhood. And not only for the people that live there, right? Because if you have a vast green accessible space within the heart of a new urban quarter, clearly this benefits the entire neighborhood and the entire vicinity, and not the people only living there. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's always about looking into the context, looking into what are the needs of the entire society, and translating it in projects in a way that will involve the people, that will be flexible, and that will benefit not only the ones living there, but entire, at least parts of the town.
Yeah. So you mentioned at the beginning their cost, and you also talked about very low budget construction, which is also what we would need to deliver the housing that's required. Yeah. And the Netherlands is, I think, particularly good at finding that price point. Is that what you experienced?
Yeah, so I would say in the Netherlands, the building culture, if you want, is very efficient, but also in a sense very stupid, because there's only one way how to achieve it. It's pouring concrete and make this very efficient tunneling system. So what you see is that it's efficient, but it's also stupid. What you need is it needs to be efficient and it needs to be smart. And a lot of it has to do with rules and regulations. So we are, as a country, really jealous of the Vienna model. I think Holland is 15 years behind what you are at, because you made it possible somehow to have into the system some kind of money flow which is really healthy, which is really working, it's really supportive, and we are just finding out in Holland that actually these systems work. And I would say now the power is to communities of 50 to 200 people that say, okay, we will do this, which is very unusual. So it's not a governmental owned housing corporation, it's not a commercial developer, but it's something in the middle, and then everybody gets really confused. The governments get confused, you don't get permits, it's really difficult, but I think for now this is the way to go until we are at this moment or this model where finances are somehow regulated within the system.
Yeah, yeah. And Tatiana, maybe from a viewpoint of Mexico City, where there's a huge demand for housing. I mean, so, what's the context there in terms of low-cost regulation and trying to deal with a lot of informal housing as well?
So right now the system has reached to a point where it has almost, kind of being the perpetrator of the problems instead of the solution of them. Because since the 70s, in Mexico, housing is a constitutional right. And the law provides all the instruments, and then obviously every government has the mandate to produce solutions, right? But the problem is that in the 70s, 80s, they understood that they were not able to fulfill the demand, not even by a minimum, every year, and that they were really starting to have a very big problem. So the solution at that time, obviously, neoliberalism sounded the solution, the perfect solution, and they left these policies and strategies for the private developers. What happens now is that the system is completely corrupted into a place where it's, producing boxes for living for a very small amount of money, then needing the cities to respond, to reach to those places, to create infrastructure and to create schools, hospitals for these people that are then thrown out to live in these places. So the system obviously is completely overwhelmed, it doesn't work. And I think it urgently needs a combination of supporting these initiatives that are happening, of people building their own communities from within in order to be able to find a next plan, within it. So there are examples happening in the ground, of initiatives. Exactly the project that we were, the strategy we designed for is a program from the government in order to fulfill the demand, while larger programs can arrive to possibilitate this. But I think it's not only that loop, the loop of creating solutions of shelters that do not provide anything else, it's kind of what is creating the problem in the roots. Because as Maria explained very well, it's not only about that roof on top of your head, it's about what that community can offer for it to survive,
So not only do we have to solve the housing problem, but we've also got to solve the infrastructure problem, the transport problem.
I would say much more deeper. You need to really allow communities to exist, in order for them to be sustainable, and then the rest can come, Yeah. But if you isolate people in shelters and just try to solve the problems for them to arrive to the services, you are really creating a bigger problem.
Yeah. So, in terms of the context that you've given us from Central Africa, how does that kind of community engagement and all of the things that come with it in terms of infrastructure, we talked about, maybe leapfrogging to, and you also talked about AI and robotics.
Well, I mean, there's some really basic questions. I mean, one of the really interesting questions is there's a lot of economic research now which is showing that if you come from a village into an African city, you're actually not going to get richer, which is the first in human civilization. Normally, when you go from the countryside to the city, you improve your quality of life and your sense of opportunity.
But urbanization's still happening, right?
Urbanization is happening, but it's not working. So one of the basic kind of...
It's not working here either, by the way. But
I mean, I think one of the Sesame Street questions that would need to be asked is...
Apart from in Vienna. Sorry, carry on.
Is like, these cities are growing fast. Should they keep growing fast? So if we look at Rwanda, the president in Rwanda has said, actually, the capital of Rwanda, Kigali, will be fixed. It's not going to have more than 300,000 or 400,000 people, you know?
Mm. But we are seeing some of the bigger global cities capping population, whether that's good or not.
Yeah. So I think there is a whole kind of reverse logic, which I would leave to the young architects in the room, where you think, without being too bucolic, what might a small town or a village which is connected digitally and which has its own renewable energy system, what might life look like there? We don't know yet, but that's an open question.
Yeah. And in terms of that sort of growth and urbanisation, from a Vienna perspective, do you actually try to attract people to come? I mean, you talked about people wanting to live in the city, but would you go as far as to say you attract people to live in the city, or discourage them? I mean, is that a conversation?
Well, Vienna is a very special story in this case because, I mean, we are in a city of not yet 2 million people. And yes, we have wanted to have young families returning from the suburbs to the city. Yeah. And in later years, we have been actually successful at this. So we have had a positive turnover towards the city in the last couple of years. But I would like, to take this a little bit further, because it's clear that we're asking ourselves, perhaps you're doing it, I'm doing it now. What does Vienna have to do with Africa? And the thought that I have all the time is that at the first level, it's about providing people, of course, with a place to live and also with something that they own, be it only even materials that they can reuse. Right? Mm-hmm. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be expandable, and it needs to be at least pre-planned in the sense that it can grow in a sustainable way. In the second level, it is about not only providing housing, but actually creating communities that can live. So social housing, subsidized housing, is a means of creating communities. And there are excellent examples in Vienna of collaborative housing projects where you have shared kitchens, shared libraries, co-working spaces. So it's not about people going into their little flats, units, and separating themselves, but on the contrary, it is about creating an active community that will serve also as a magnet for the entire neighborhood. And in the third level, it's about realizing that subsidized housing can stand at the heart of transforming neighborhoods and transforming entire cities, because in the end, what is transforming a city? It's creating a network of new places and connecting them with old places, already existing parts of the city, to the benefit of everybody. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not just about houses, it's about cities.
Yeah. It's quite interesting that you talked about the shared spaces, and when we looked at different projects in Vienna, that can happen in a lot of different ways, and that's also something that we looked at different typologies which work in different places. I think sort of shared living in the Netherlands, is that something that helps in terms of allowing smaller units and more use of public spaces.
Yeah, so that is what happens, and I totally agree with you, Maria. So it's just most architects are really good at making objects, but there are not so many architects good at making communities, right? And that is, of course, what is needed. And in Holland now there is this need for 1 million new homes. So the minister sort of has assumed 1 million, 1 million. So and then they start stacking these boxes. This incredibles like refugee housing. You have this 35-meter square box, and they stack them, and there's a metal gallery in the back, and another 1,000. And so everybody is happy for the first year, I imagine, and then after 2 or 3 or 4 years, you will start wondering why did we ever do this? So the goal can never be a number, right? The goal has to be a community that is healthy, sustainable, and it's my view that thinking along circular economy lines or circular or regenerative design actually allows you to be more intelligent with material, with construction, with the contractor, with financial modes even, that actually this allows you to make affordable housing in the city, right? So because the cities are becoming more and more difficult for, say, normal people to live in, because it's really expensive. Like in Munich, I don't know about Vienna so much, but to buy a home is, if you have a first job, you cannot buy a home in Amsterdam. It's impossible. Yeah. But I think thinking along circular strategies, actually this would be possible, because building is not a waste or something that is against nature, but it's an act of nature. So actually it helps you to make affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And I think thinking along these paradigm shifts is only just starting, but it needs so much energy and design thinking.
I think that I'm going to come for questions in a moment, so please have some questions ready. That you talked about the circular economy needs systemic change, and it's happening slowly. You used the word there, slowly, and we've been talking about the speed that we need to go at. And I think you made a very good analogy. Even though I've never played tennis with Rafa Nadal, I imagine the ball would go by pretty quickly, and it certainly feels like that. And it's taken us a really long time just to get to a sort of base level in terms of addressing climate change. And when you look at the housing emergency that we have, I don't even feel like we're at the same level of debate there. So it feels like we're
I think you're right.
We're going slowly.
The City of Madrid has an annual budget of around 6 billion euros, and UN Habitat has a budget of 80 million euros a year. So UN Habitat, when you add in like UN salaries and running costs, basically they're not able to. So it really is a shout out for architects, engineers, planners to. I mean, you see like young people going into art galleries and throwing oil over paintings. You'd like to see in the architectural profession that young architects get a little bit radical about this issue. Yep. It's simply intolerable, the numbers you were talking about. Yep. Essentially a third of humanity living in squalor. Yep. It's not Dickensian England, we should be able to do better than this. Right?
I'm not sure about the way to do it, but I certainly agree with that the urgency needs to be raised up for sure.
I would like to make a point. If we continue to create houses that are that for living in them depend on the whole system of infrastructure at large, then we're going to be having the same problem all the time, because we're never going to reach that. If the houses need to be, kind of sustained to exist, to live by the sanitary system, by the educational system, they depend on that, and the transport system, on the productive system, and they cannot be held by itself, then the circle is going to be endless always. Mm. We need to create communities that hold the existence together, and then the rest is supportive, So the house needs to be the first hospital, the first school, the first care center, the first child care, the first...
What comes first, The house is coming first?
Yes.
Or the infrastructure is coming first?
No, the house is coming first.
the house is
As supportive for bodies.
Take a pause for a moment just to see if we've got questions from the audience. We've got a few moments for that. There's a hand.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize for my English. And I have a question. You talked about the quality of living and the sustainable of the houses, and I think that is the most important thing when you make a house. But in the cities, the major problem is the prices, and young people can't afford a house. And you think that the solution is to hide construction, and you think that the high construction can compromise the quality of living in cities? Thank you.
Would you like?
Yes, I would say do not be afraid of verticality. Of course, this does not necessarily mean that it fits everywhere, in every size, all the time. You need to analyze it. But density need not mean that quality will not be good. On the contrary, I think that, again, if you look into a sustainable future, and if you look into us all being asked to try not to cover Greenland, on the contrary, to try to uncover Greenland, cement, so to do de-cementation. This necessarily means that at a certain point you need to address very open the issue of verticality, which then gives you the opportunity, though, to create again vast green spaces and places, beautiful places for life. It needs to be well designed.
That's a great question. Thank you. It's one of the topics that we've talked about in terms of density and typology. Another question? One more? Just over there.
Hi. First of all, thank you all for everything that you've shared today. My question goes to everyone, but especially Tatiana, because I feel like her situation reaches closer to home. I come from Venezuela, and I would love to go back to my country one day to rebuild what has been broken. And it feels like a very big task, and it's very scary, actually. And basically what I would like to know is that we're talking about building new communities, but what about those that are broken and that we want to rebuild? Because I feel like we might want to take different measures or take different things into consideration. Thank you.
That's a difficult question. I mean, I think that we now often as society feel overwhelmed by the huge amount of issues that we're facing, no? And the numbers and the emergency in which we are in. And this has, I think, halted the process of, or the capability of thinking that we can become part of the solution, no? But I think that if we kind of elaborate what we can contribute to that, I mean, your willingness to go back and doing it, put yourself on the ground and try to rebuild your own community, and that will already make a big step, you know? And we need to, if we all think like that, then we can really make a change, no? The worst we can do is sit and say, this problem is overwhelming. It doesn't matter if I just use this plastic bag, it will not do anything. I mean, there are millions of plastic bags out there. Well, if we all think the same, then we will never undo anything, right? So I'm very glad you are willing to do that. My point is, you should say, the thing you make makes the other one make the change, and the other one make the change, and this is how we do it.
Tatiana,
that's the only thing I can say.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the questions. We're now on to... There are lots. No, I think we finished with questions, I'm afraid. We've just run out of time, but we do have a next part, which I think everyone will enjoy, with lots of questions to come. So if you can thank the panel. We've
from emergency housing to the housing's emergency. Against the pandemic, governments make a very simple recommendation: stay at home and wash your hands. But what seems to be a no-brainer for many is something impossible for billions. The pandemic exposed the magnitude of the inequalities of our societies. The housing crisis is not only a question of poverty anymore, but literally a question of life and death. We have the challenge to fill this double gap, the sanitary and the social one. But the difficulty is the 3S menace: the scale, speed, and scarcity of means with which we will have to overcome the housing deficit has no precedence in human history. Conventional procedures have been unable to respond to such challenge. So, what to do? When there's no time nor money to deliver everything on day one, use incremental design as an antidote against scarcities. An open system that, over time, can achieve the required standard that emergency and scarce resources prevent from happening. A prototype that we are testing starts with prefabricated, state-of-the-art piece of infrastructure that, in order to gain precious time, can work initially with off-the-grid basic services. Following a counterintuitive sequence, such structural but also legal frame takes care of everything that a family can do on their own. It is followed by an incremental sanitation, an incremental housing, and incremental urbanism. If we adhere to a participatory process, people will be part of the solution. In other words, against the 3S menace, the 3P Alliance, a coordinated action of public and private sector, can put in place the basics and channel people's own capacities, resources, and preferences.
And now it's my very, very great pleasure to invite Alejandro Aravena and Norman Foster onto the stage for a discussion. Welcome, please. So there's an awful lot to unpack there. That was your incremental building project, but the last part of it, the people, and maybe picking up the thread of community and kind of rebuilding communities with some of those projects. Perhaps you'd say a bit about that engagement and rebuilding of communities and the people part of it when it comes to speed.
Is it working? Yes.
Yeah.
So first 30 seconds. I know we have very little time, but I want to thank you to come on a rainy day. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be able to meet face to face. That's still unbeatable, to exchange knowledge. So thank you for being here. There are many, if not architect students or young architects here. I would like to start maybe from my experience while studying architecture. I was trained to have control over the production of an object, a building, and trying to put in place space, form, aesthetics, materials. And if you were able to control that properly, then you may eventually were going to be celebrated by producing those objects. I would like to build on Jonathan's image of Rafael Nadal. So in a way, I was trained to play tennis. But the housing problem is another sport. There may be some buildings that are like tennis where you have to control. But in the housing case, it's a mix of rugby and surfing. It's tough and gracious at the same time. So how do you combine and balance these two complete different muscles from tennis? This is a complete different thing. You have to learn how to lose control, or let's say channel the issue. So that being said, very quickly, the question of the big challenge of the housing emergency. In principle, on the slide you showed said that we have to produce we will have to produce, and I underline the word will. We will have to produce 100,000 units per day. If we don't do so, then we will get slums. Well, I think personally I got it all wrong until 5 minutes ago when I was listening to the presentations. Because the housing problem is already solved. The world is already producing 100,000 units per day. So that's not the question we need to answer. People are already building 100,000 units per day. So the question is, what is not solved is what is in between the houses. So the scarcest resource is not money, it's coordination. So what's the role? I'm going back to the question of what are we as architects being trained, is not to produce those housing units that are already being solved by funds. That's why I say that people, it's part of the solution, not part of the problem. Our task as architects will be that, as in surf and as in rugby, of course I don't play rugby, you can tell by my...
But you surf.
No, not really. So it's just a metaphor. But in any case, we have to learn to channel that capacity. It's not an incapacity, it's a huge capacity that without any type of help from states nor professionals, people are still able to produce that. And that is an incredible capacity that we as designers may have to use different tools just to channel that. Individual actions, even if well-intentioned, cannot guarantee common good. So the question is, how do we design that common good? I guess that the biggest challenge for us as architects and design tools that we will have to put in place is what's not going to be built. How do we preserve the space in between the houses that a slum spontaneously cannot guarantee?
Yeah. And Norman, that's the kind of mobilizing the people part of it. We talked about the public sector and actually the purpose of your foundation to enable the public, the political side of it. Perhaps you'd say a few words about how you see that.
I think, Alejandro, your genius as an architect is that you have your creations, what you've described, is in microcosm a master plan, because you have defined the strategy and left the infill up to the family, whoever is going to inhabit that. But you've created a strategic framework. You can't go out beyond a certain boundary. So, and this conversation comes down in the end to infrastructure. because it's the infrastructure, the urban glue that binds the buildings together. It's the public spaces, it's the mix of activities. And there was a comment earlier which I understood and sympathized with, and that was architects are not very good at creating communities. And that's because they've been trained to create individual buildings and not, so we see time and time again, and one of the things that we've learned through the workshop is good practice and bad practice, questionable practice. We've seen honorable schemes by architects in master plans which have been imposed and given the conditions with total absence of everything that would make a neighborhood. I mean, if I started with the house, and we call it affordable housing, let's change the affordable to essential. Let's change the housing to homes. And what makes a collection of homes? It's a neighborhood. And ideally within walking distance, and this is the magic of what Maria from Vienna has been explaining, a neighborhood that's walkable, where you have the access to work, where you have kindergarten, schools, shops, all the things. It's the neighborhood. And the master plan, which is a bottom-up process, is the key to that. So we're seeing international exhibitions for housing within a framework which has been imposed by a ministry. Why do we not have a competition for the master plan? And why are not the participants for a master plan, not just architects, but also engineers, sociologists? And we've seen the success of that process in other fields. We've seen it with major works of infrastructure where you've had mixed team of disciplines rather than a single discipline. So all of this in the end comes down to enlightened leadership. And I think the foundation in that respect is bringing together a younger generation who are the civic leaders of the future. And already in 5 years, we have now a mayor in a city in Chile who's come through that process and is aware of all of these issues. And there are, I mean, extraordinary precedents from the past. I mean, if you can't, if everything is in the private sector and your master planning has to come out of mixed disciplines from outside, there's also the other example of, in the past, London County Council in the 1950s, facing a crisis of housing and rebuilding after the war, rooted in the 40s. In the 40s, it was the valuers department that determined, and they used outdated models. And it was the architects within the London County Council, which at that time was the largest architectural practice in the world. And there were hundreds. And they were the best names who went on, people like Dennis Lasdon, Colin Ward, Lou Betkin. They were the star architects of the period. And that was the ultimate kind of accolade to get into that. And the master planning in the war by Abercrombie, which had the support of all the sectors of the community. The king and queen lived in the palace in the middle of London through the Blitz. Endorsed that plan. That was about neighborhoods, it was about the green belt, it was avoiding sprawl, it was about the compact, walkable city. So I could go on at length. I mean, industrialization is part of that process. Recycling, the obsolete office buildings of the moment are perfect for recycling as housing that could accommodate those who are essential to the running of the city, rather than being forced out into the periphery.
You're kind of both making it sound so easy.
Can I build on?
Go ahead, yeah.
You've just mentioned this word essential, so to go to the essence. And I think that's the more complex the problem, the more the need for synthesis. It's not reduction, it's synthesis. And I don't know if you've been to the foundation. There you see a lifetime of somebody wanting to take out everything that's not strictly necessary in a structure, every gram, so that you go to the essence of how forces will move in a building. And I guess that again, with these issues, these challenges, the question is, can you do the same thing, just not with weight, but with the forces at play that are social, political, environmental, and again, find that essential moment so that we can channel these other lives that in the end will have to be channeled. And I guess that the question of irreducibility, how can you achieve to a point where things cannot be further decomposed, and yet that ignites and generates a process. I would encourage you to go there and to look at with those eyes and try to apply, again, those lessons to these different sports that now we will have to play in the built environment.
And it's interesting, the idea around sort of taking things back to their essence, building the basic frames and the modular system, that's also something that we're exploring. Do you think that those things can happen quickly enough to solve the problem? And is there the sort of layer that Norman's talking around the master plan, can that also come quickly enough?
Well, of course, it's a question of priorities. And again, if we go to people, if people are living in scarce environments, if they know anything, it's how to establish priorities. They have to be extremely strategic of what doing first and what can come over time. So again, when doing participatory processes, that I guess it's not just a hippie romantic question of giving people the pencil or the mouse to say, would you like your house to look like? It's first and foremost to identify the question. It's not asking the people what is the answer. We need from them we designers need to understand what is the question. Once we have identified the question, then we need to have two types of knowledge come together. Our professional knowledge, which is the power of synthesis of design, organize information in a proposal key, and their knowledge to establish priorities. There is a huge amount of wisdom embedded in participatory design, and if we do so, then we can move fast. Because I'm not doing what they will be doing over time. I can focus my own performance in very few essential moves. And then, if I did my work well, then they will not perform things that are technically difficult. They will just enclose space, as they are doing today in slums, that if anything, they're fast. So again, the question is solved there. So we need to bring these two types of knowledge together and coexist. And so I guess that if we divide tasks, and that is why it makes so much sense to have people sitting on the table on day one.
Mm. And Norman, do you also feel like we can move at that speed in the sort of context that we're working in European cities?
If there's a political will to do that, yes. But that comes back to enlightened leadership. I mean, I'm encouraged by initiatives, United Nations. I head out the Forum of Mayors, and that brings annually mayors together to share knowledge, to pool experience. The Secretary General wanted to get out the message about the importance of master planning. So there is an awareness of the importance, the strategic importance at a political level. But how can I say, the lessons from Vienna are very much the interplay between an awareness of what is obvious to those who have been through the experience of seeing roads removed, returned to park, the encouragement of a pedestrian-friendly, bicycle-friendly city. Meanwhile, we're witnessing the biggest highway in the world being built on the west coast of Africa. We're seeing China, which used to be dominated by the bicycle, given over to the car, and then having to rethink and restructure a city like Shenzhen, for example. So all of this links to zoning, the mentality of creating that housing outside the city, with none of the facilities, and mandating, unlike as we've heard in Vienna, mandating that there is a 1 car per apartment, which creates an underground garage and encourages the lemming-like rush into the city centre. And it becomes just a dormitory. And that doesn't need to happen. That's about attitude of mind. It's about awareness, and it's about leadership coupled with understanding, knowledge, and enlightenment.
And back to your point around the master plan, that locks in so many of those things for the future. So, you know, we're as we're going through this week, and we know it's not just about the housing, right? It's about the mobility,
yes,
it's about the public
I think that
spaces.
master plan has unfortunate connotations in its language. Maybe it's a strategic plan. But I mean, if you take London and you couple one urban design initiative to look at one particular area, together with the political will to enforce congestion charging, that led us over a long period, 7 years, to transform Trafalgar Square. But that was a consultative process. It involved exhibitions, questionnaires, 27,000 drivers interviewed, and finally that road closed. You can then measure the consequences of those two initiatives. Carbon dioxide went down by almost 20%, congestion 1/3. Walking distances were halved, pedestrian activity increased by a factor of 13. So tangible benefits, and you know, so I have great optimism in the future, because what I'm seeing in the initiatives by the foundation, I'm encouraged by the younger generations, by their openness and their ability to observe and make these judgments, which I think will prepare them for the future. I'm encouraged by the attitude of the United Nations. I despair at times when I see things perpetrated today which we know have already been disproven and are just fashion. You know, it's like the electric vehicle. If the electricity that's pumped into that comes out of a fossil fuel generated electricity, it's dirty. Where you can create fuel by decarbonizing the ocean with an abundance of clean energy. So it comes back to leadership, and in the end, everything is about design. Combating climate change is about design.
Yeah. And Alejandro, are you also optimistic? We've had so many.
I'm eager to get messy
Let's
here
get
and open the question right away. I mean, we
need somebody to disagree with
questions already. I mean, the most interesting part is Q&A.
I think you are both very convincing, but let's see what the audience think.
Yeah.
There's a question there.
If you raise your voice, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
So it's been talked about, okay, I think you can hear me. It's been talked about how circular economy and communities are so well for the future and for now, for affordable housing. But the truth is, or where I think that it's happening, that individualism, it's still so present in our communities. So as architects, how can we project the projects? Well, how can we project them and make it appealing for these communities to want to work with us in the participatory design?
Alejandro, you invited the questions.
The expression of the individual, some of the most desirable real estate in the world, the most sought after places to live. And Vienna came top of that list. And if you look at the number 2, 3, and 4, they're characterized by extraordinary uniformity. I mean, some of the most elegant terraces in the world with public spaces are the most desirable. They're also the most repetitive. And they allow the individual expression within those walls in the same way that within your master plan, where you build half of it, but you totally predetermine what can happen, not what can happen within it, but the constraints. And within those constraints, you have unlimited scope for individual freedom. Look at the extent to which everybody customizes their computer or their telephone.
Yeah. So let me again dismantle a little bit some of the assumptions in your question. The debate between individualism and collective, as one being evil, the other one being something desirable. I would put a question mark on that, or at least be skeptic about assuming right away that each of them are labeled as such. So how to start this battle against some of these cliches? Well, it's very expensive to be poor. If you have to buy sugar, you can only buy 1/8 of a kilogram, unless, and that's what you see, the first you see when trying to work with the poor environments, that the notion of, as Tatiana was saying, the nuclear family doesn't make any sense. So immediately it's an extensive family with relatives, so it's more like a small tribe than a family. But there's no translation into space of that social organization. So more than making it appealing, it's a question of reading properly what's out there as a structure that hasn't found the translation into space, and it's our task to translate that into a territorial structure that is able to accommodate that. One of the 5 points about the social housing as an investment that can gain value over time, but at the same time focuses on what families can't do on their own, which is, I would say, the definition of a public policy. You take care of what cannot be done properly at an individual scale. One of those aspects is that in the urban fabric, you see today a binary structure. It's either the public or the private. The notion of the collective is not the most used or the most common thing that you can find there. And at that level of association, that has to respect the individuality of the family. I mean, this kind of being forced to be collective, it's really no good. You will find that people complaining about that in the projects you're doing. Yet, they also want to find the level of association that allows them, for example, if they want to, between all of them, to buy an inflatable pool. That doesn't happen in a street. But if you have a common courtyard, that may happen. There's an amount of issues that can be regulated by this social scale that normally doesn't find the translation into space. Social control being one of those most important issues. In a group of around 30 families, you know who is who. So in case you have an agreed rule, that rule will be followed just because you have a face-to-face contact, not because it's written on a piece of paper. So that social contract, we have to be very attentive to read if that is the case. It's not always the case. But in case there is that, well, be sure that you will use your design tools to be able to translate that into a design.
Good. More questions? There's one over there.
I really like the idea of incremental housing because I think it marries the idea of economic model being solved through architecture. And I come from Bombay, which is a city in India, and we have a problem of slums over there. And we've studied a lot of ideas of incremental housing. But how do you think that we can solve, we can use incremental housing to solve an area of such high density, where even the most luxury housing is in skyscrapers? Do you think that we can use, incremental housing for extremely high density projects?
Or I would say for dense enough projects. Our experience, and this might be very technical, is that in 3 stories, a house underneath and an apartment on top, and let me step backwards a little bit. I guess that when you're working in socially fragile environments, you have to make sure that you're prepared for the worst case scenario. If you have to depend from an elevator to go to your flat, and people don't pay the repair or the maintenance of the elevator, then that project is condemned to failure, or it isn't prepared to every scenario. So I guess that if we're able to achieve dense enough projects in low rise, by low rise I mean 4 or 5 stories. Paris used to have 7, maybe that's a little bit too much. You have to carry bags 7 floors up. maybe 4 to 5, then you are designing something that is dense enough, able to pay for well-located land, close to opportunities, and that is still prepared for the worst case scenario. So the thing is that for that, in an incremental design, you build the structure for your final scenario. Meaning, and again, I'm going to a little bit of facts here, in average in the world, public policies in developing countries can afford around 40 square meters. Evidence shows that the growth or a family can live reasonably well in around 80. And that's a fact. People will make their households grow even if you didn't prepare them for that. So better be aware that that will happen anyhow and build the structure for the final scenario, because the structure is something that is very difficult for a family to do on their own. Closing rooms is relatively easy. Pavements, ceilings, all the finishings, that is what we were trained for as architects, which was where you control the look of the thing. Well, that doesn't belong to the difficult half of the house. So incrementality in that sense, and the structure is one of those things that is preparing or guaranteeing common good and then channeling individual actions inside. With that, you can achieve until around 750 to 900 inhabitants per hectare. And that's already, for example, 10 times more what the average density of a city like Santiago is. 2 or 3 stories, well designed and with a void well coordinated, triples or 4 times the density that we already have in a relatively low rise.
More questions? We've got time for one more, so who wants to ask the last question? I'm sure someone does.
All the doubts were solved.
We all solved it all.
Obviously, you answered every...
No, Jonathan.
If nobody else wants to ask a question, then we'll let Jonathan ask.
I just want, the one thing we haven't really dealt with is the political aspect of ownership. How do we define ownership with affordable housing? And Norman, in particular, with the British experience of Thatcherism, where we did actually have a state of subsidized social, what we say, council housing, and that was somehow deemed to be inferior. And Margaret Thatcher came along in the 1980s and she said, no, people should own their own homes. And of course, there's like a positive and a negative to that equation. But as we're looking to the rest of the planet, what about this political question of ownership?
I think if the political leadership is essentially reinforcing the notion that you're successful if you own your own home and you're a failure if you're paying rent, then that's deplorable and not surprising some of the consequences that follow from that. That's where the pooling of knowledge comes. I mean, in Switzerland, it's much more normal to rent than to own. The same is true in Vienna. We've heard about the 60% of affordable, but 80% is rental. In Singapore, 80% is provided accommodation. I think the rental model is admirable, and there are many different forms of ownership, as we've talked about this week in the workshop. So I think we really have to break through these taboos. It wasn't all that long ago that the most desirable, the most elite place to live was in a hotel room. If you go through the suites in some hotels, for example, in Paris, a hotel with the Chopin suite, the Chanel suite, and I think that younger generations don't have those taboos and would welcome the idea of a building where you could rent an apartment and you have the facility of a fantastic club, a sports club, a restaurant, a cafe, and if you grow and you have a family and you want a bigger apartment, then you can find that within that building. I think the design opportunities are amazing.
Indeed. Do you want a last
Yeah,
word?
And I'd love to design the higher rise building, which is not a walk-up, but has all the opportunities for infill, and has the structure for the concierge who looks after the building, the family which lives in, with the lifts. And Madrid is just such a beautiful example of a medium rise, walkable, desirable, human, sustainable city, along with many others which have that model. Paris, the center of London, they're all high density and highly desirable. Why are those lessons not being taken out into new developments?
Last word?
Yes. I would like to connect the political issue with design, and around the question of ownership. Well, first, I think it's not or, it's and. The toolbox, the challenge is so big that the toolbox has to be as large as possible. So with property, without property, with rent, it's all of them, not trying to. That being said, I'm coming from Chile, where we're discussing now a new constitution. And of course, one of the questions there is the notion of property, and particularly in housing, that I was asked many, many times, whether because in the constitution there was not the word property, then people will lose their households. And there was a big fear around that property was not there anymore. By the way, in Pinochet constitution, there's not even the word housing. Yet, for the last 30 years, we were delivering private ownership, market-oriented housing. So the fear of the right was kind of difficult to support. But in any case, that was the issue. When the notion of property, in my context, was labeled as some bourgeois, capitalist, neoliberal issue, and it was preferable just to have no ownership because that was more democratic, more generous, and more it was about solidarity. When you go and ask the people, they say, look, if I own the house, I'm not sure if my children will be able to have a job or an education, but at least they will inherit a house. So this is not a neoliberal capitalist thing. It's a question of having something safe and secure. So what is the point of design in case where in the developing world, housing policies are property oriented? You become the owner of the house once you get a subsidy. The thing is that if through design you are able to make that housing unit to gain value over time, because housing is the biggest transfer of public money into a family asset. But in social housing, it looks closer to buy a car than a house. The value goes down. But all of us, when buying a house, expect it to grow its value over time. There are 5 design conditions that can, of course, they cannot guarantee, but there are higher chances of that transfer of public money can grow its value over time. Location, number 1, so dense enough projects able to pay for more expensive, well-located land. The urban layout with the collective in between the public and the private. Structure for the final scenario. The technical difficult part of the house, bathroom, kitchen, partition walls being taken care in a professional way, and a middle-class DNA. I would just name it. It takes longer to explain it. But in any case, if that happens, then through ownership, housing is not just a shelter against the environment, but it may become a tool to overcome poverty. And this may be one of the most powerful things that we may be contributing if we do our architect's job in a good way.
So, Jonathan, thank you for the last question and the analogy now. I hope that we've managed to return the serve at least. We've heard lots of fantastic ideas and also very diverse from different parts of the world. So I've gone away, or I'm going away, with much more optimism, even though it's clearly an emergency, and we're perhaps redefining it from affordable housing to essential homes, and I think that's also a little bit of a takeaway. Thank you to the Holcim Foundation for Sustainable Construction for their sponsorship of the evening, and for our hosts, the Norman Foster Foundation. But now, for all of you, perhaps you'd thank Alejandro and Norman for their fantastic and energised debate.
Yeah, well done.